Alors pour ouvrir cette journée, on a un jeune, Tomas Ros, qui, alors, il m'a dit de le présenter comme ça, qui n'est pas jardinier, qui n'est pas astronome, qui n'est pas sociologue, mais qui pense qu'en neurosciences, il y a besoin d'une approche transdisciplinaire, innovante, créative, pour aborder les thématiques actuelles qui font la richesse de cette discipline et de l'intérêt pour la psychiatrie. Alors, je vais lui laisser la parole. Son approche, je pense, est très originale parce que ce n'est pas une approche de neuroscientifique mécanistique, c'est une approche de neuroscientifique physiologiste. On parlait de Delay tout à l'heure. Les premiers physiologues, ils s'intéressaient à l'homéostasie du fonctionnement du milieu intérieur et de l'organisme. Et je pense, et on est très heureux d'avoir Tomas Ros parce qu'on pense qu'il s'inscrit aussi dans la nouveauté, dans des modèles très innovants au sein des neurosciences pour les neurofeedback, mais aussi dans la continuité de ce qu'était la neurophysiologie par des personnes comme Jean Delay ou du RUP-FSR qui ont été à l'origine du concept de neurofeedback dans cet intérêt psychophysiologique pour ce lien entre activité cérébrale et activité mentale.
Today I'm going to be talking about, as you can see from the title, Neurofeedback Learning. But in the original program it said Neurofeedback Learning and plasticity processes. But I think learning and plasticity have a very strong overlap, so I've tried to decompose it into two components where you have the control and plasticity processes which then lead to sort of the overall theme of learning. But for you who haven't heard about neurofeedback, I just added the introductory slide about how the neurofeedback works. And this is to start with that it's a special application of a brain-computer interface. So what is exactly a brain-computer interface? It's simply a device that measures brain activity in real time and that is able to provide processed information for some kind of either command or even feedback. So here, for example, you have the brain, which is the signal is acquired either through an MRI scanner or EEG. There's some pre-processing where some features of brain activity are extracted, and then based on those kind of activities, measures are calculated. For example, the amplitude of the alpha wave, and then this is re-represented in a sensory manner, either auditory, visual, usually, where the subject can get sort of a feel for what is actually happening in their brain in real time. And that allows the person to control certain things in the outside or the inside. So basically the concept is that there's a real-time link between brain and behavior, which we know, which is causal, and that actual overt behaviors have neurophysiological underpinnings. For example, when you imagine motor movement, in this case you would be imagining moving the right hand compared to moving the actual right hand. Really, a paralyzed patient who has lost complete overt movement will still use that signature to basically control the wheelchair to go left and right, just by simply imagining left hand or right hand movement. Okay, so those kind of mental phenomena have specific brain correlates. But that's the classic application of BCI, where you use brain patterns to control certain devices. But there's a distinction there, a slight subtle distinction between BCI, classic BCI, and neurofeedback itself that most people probably don't appreciate, but that there is a similarity where both of these techniques use closed-loop control, and I'll get to what closed-loop control means. But just in advance, so that you know there is a difference, because in the classic BCI case, and there are now hybrid BCIs which use different methods, but in the classic BCI, the assumption is that to execute a command, for example, to control a wheelchair, you need to have a specific activity which doesn't change. So that's static. And that means that if that activity is constantly the same, then we can use that signature to exert commands, and therefore those things are reliable. But in neurofeedback, in fact, we have control of the activity itself, but on top of that, we actually try to modify the activity in the sort of long term. So in fact, it's a shifting landscape. That's the essential difference, that neurofeedback is used to change the activity of the brain itself, rather than for another aim. And this is where I want to introduce that the concept of neurofeedback learning involves both of those processes. And I will try to talk about each one separately, and then try to put them together. So let's start with control. And I know we're here in the physics building, so I like to think of neurofeedback as a closed loop. and it's logical that feedback loops have the word feedback in them. So why not try to think about it like this? And just one example of how this might work is if you think a house thermostat, how it regulates temperature, and you can then just translate this to how do we regulate maybe brain activity. So for example, here you would have a set point in the system, which is basically what you would set your thermostat to, what your desired temperature would be in your room, and let's say that's 20 degrees. But let's say it's very cold outside, and suddenly the temperature drops to 15 degrees inside. That's here. That's the sensor here that records the inside temperature. Then there's a difference error that's calculated between the set point and the sensor, and you can see here it's -5. If the difference becomes negative, then the controller sees that this is not 0, and it will then engage the central heating to heat up the room until the difference is 0. It calculates in real time, obviously, as it's heating. The temperature goes to 16, 17, 17, 18, 19, 20. When it gets to 20, it has a 0 error, then it stops the heating. And that's a control system. And so on. If it's too hot, then it can also switch off the heating to make it cooler and so on. But it goes in both directions. So, and there's another example is cruise control in the car, where you're also sensing, the computer is sensing the speed of the vehicle, and it computes this difference error between the actual speed and the desired speed, and it can keep this loop going very accurately so that the car speed is constant. And that allows, in fact, very good control, which would be probably better than human control itself. So what we think is that neurofeedback as a BCI device introduces this high fidelity, both temporally and specific sensing of a particular activity, which is usually unconscious. So the important thing to note is that the control is only successful for observable variables. So if you don't have observation of that variable, it's very difficult. You're going to control it directly. You can control it indirectly through some kind of internal models, but internal models are always approximative. So in real life phenomena, especially if you're trying to control some kind of unconscious activity, it's easier to use the direct variable itself. So that's what neurofeedback does. It allows you to sense the variable directly. And that's what this slide shows, is that it enables unobservable brain activity to be observable. So it makes unconscious activity conscious, and it then facilitates possibly control of that activity. So what does a neurofeedback loop look like in real life? Well, here you go. These are the 3 phases. There's the detection phase, where you record with an electrode. That gets fed into a computer, which processes some online information. The therapist or the researcher is changing some settings to see what this activity looks like. And then that's displayed on another computer screen, which provides the actual visual feedback to the subject, and then this person is trying to control with changing its mental state to affect the signal, i.e. to affect its own activity. And let's talk about EEG in specific. I mean, most of my talk is going to be about EEG, but I think it might also apply to other types of brain activity. And in EEG, there are different dimensions, but 2 dimensions you can look at is the amplitude and the frequency dimension. So this is what you see here in this trace. In 1 second you have these oscillations. Each of these traces is an electrode on the scalp. And this is your cumulative activity of these oscillations. And if you look at the amplitude domain, that's basically the size of the oscillation, how big is the wave. The frequency is like the space in between the peaks, which is kind of how quickly the activity cycles. And you can see here there's some large waves like here, which have high amplitude and low frequency, because the distance between the peaks is low. And very low amplitude and high frequency, with the distance between the peaks is the distance between the peaks is high, and here the distance between the peaks is small. So this is kind of usually from 2 hertz to 40 hertz, the main of neurofeedback, but there's also higher frequencies we can look at. And so based on this activity, what can we do in neurofeedback? So this is just one practical example of if you wanted to regulate the alpha amplitude. So essentially the size of these big waves here, you see they fluctuate. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small. So in a sort of a spontaneous state of the brain, these signals fluctuate, these amplitudes fluctuate, and you can take a filter and filter out just the alpha band, which is from around 10 hertz, and then you can have a dynamic visual display of this activity in real time. So every half a second, this bar would change in amplitude, okay? And that's basically the neurofeedback. And let's say on average it's around 18 microvolts, and then it fluctuates. But let's say the goal of the neurofeedback is to increase this activity, like they do sometimes in meditation. Well, you have to set some kind of reference to say, okay, this is high and this is low. And this is what we call the reference or the threshold or the set point in control theory, which is just like the set point in the thermostat. You're saying, okay, well, this is my reference, I want it to be larger than this or around this value. And then let's say once you cross the set point, there's something happens that during this other kind of feedback where you get some kind of reward, it's motivating you. So for example, this mandala will start spinning every time the amplitude goes above the set point, okay? Or the sound will come on every time you go above the set point. So the person has this dichotomous feedback where they're kind of inside a good state or outside the good state. And so they're trying to learn how to produce more and more of the state by simply looking at the dynamic display and increasing sort of this amplitude and the brain state associated with it. And my talk is, as Jean-Mathieu said, is going to be quite physiological. I'm not going to enter into too many psychological processes, because these are quite sort of theoretical and speculative, but we know quite a lot from neuroscience and how EEG signals are generated. And here I just want to show you that what does the EEG signal represent? Well, it represents sort of coherent synaptic activity inside the cortex. And this means that each of these synapses and neurons are actually laminarly organized, so they have a very organized structure, which means that when there is a small depolarization of the synapse, you can actually, there's a field that's electromagnetic field that's created by the ionic conductances. Usually that's small, but because this laminar profile is very regular, these activities can sum in space and then conduct all the way to the electrode. And if there's sum in time as well, then you have a large signal. So here, for example, if each one is firing individually, okay, then the signal that you record is quite small. It's still variable, but because of destructive interference and there's no constructive sort of summation of the signal has a small variance and a small amplitude. Conversely, if now you see all these neurons sort of synchronized together, like crickets, then you have this large fluctuation, so the signal goes from a high amplitude to a low amplitude when they're silenced, and then high amplitude again. And this is how the brain waves are generated. And just to reiterate the point, this is maybe something you remember from physics class, constructive and destructive interference. If you have two neurons and they're basically adjacent to each other, then the field of each one will produce, so let's say the black neuron is the black trace and the orange trace is the second neuron. When they become in phase, so they actually fire together, then the summation, which you would be recording with the local field potential or the EEG, would be larger when they're in phase and smaller out of phase. So that's sort of a local measure of intracortical synchrony is the amplitude. So the question is, can people learn to change this synchronization pattern, and what kind of states are associated with it? And that's what neurofeedback, some of the first research in neurofeedback is try to detect and show that this is possible. So here's one publication in 2005 that tried to replicate some of the beta upregulation training. So beta is a little bit of a faster band from alpha, but they showed that you can learn to increase beta amplitude compared to your resting state. So it's important to distinguish between the task-related state, which is the kind of neurofeedback when you're receiving neurofeedback signal, which means you have this closed loop control, and what happens with your brain is just sort of chilling out, doing nothing, spontaneous activity. So what is the kind of baseline state? And here you can see clearly over a session of 1,500 seconds, these blocks here, the gray blocks, are the neurofeedback blocks. So this is what you would consider in control theory as a signal, sort of the change in the signal from the noise, and the rest would be the resting sort of amplitude in between. These are the kind of break blocks, and you can see there's a difference in amplitude between this the rest and the signal. And importantly, it's about not just the mean change, but also the distribution. So statistics, you would know that there's a difference between two distributions if there's a change in the mean as well as the variance. So the important thing is to also consider the variance when you're saying, okay, this signal is being controlled properly or not. And one thing to note, that control by itself sort of infirms that this is a transient change. So you have transient change during the feedback, system goes back down to baseline, and you have another transient change. So in a way, it's kind of a control system but the system is not really having any kind of plasticity in it. And this is what you would expect also in a BCI application. So the rest signal is always the same, and the control signal is kind of the same. And I admit also there's quite complex aspects of how these different signals are mediated or regulated in the brain, because the brain is a network. So if you want to control local activity, there's many different regions coordinating to engage to control this activity. So this is an example of a study that showed that for people who could control these beta rhythms very well, i.e. here beta modulation range, good controllers, they have this kind of pattern, connectivity pattern in the brain. So they're trying to control beta rhythms in the left motor cortex, and here you can see that there's connectivity patterns that are more lateralized to the left hemisphere. And these are so-called good controllers. Whereas the bad controllers, those ones that are not able to elevate the beta rhythm, have more distributed patterns that also engage the right hemisphere. So these are the subtle, important differences between good and bad regulators and good and bad controllers. And this is a separate topic that we don't have time for today, and I think nobody really knows the answer to that, how the brain really learns to control. And there's probably some plasticity there in learning to control the signal, but for the intent of this talk, we consider that the control signal is the person has already learned how to control the signal, but then what happens long term once the control is established? And that's the question about the plasticity. So plasticity, otherwise known as memory, how does that play a role in neurofeedback training? And I think this is what distinguishes neurofeedback most from these classic BCI approaches. So I want to introduce two types of plasticity. The first one is called heavy plasticity, and it's so-called associative plasticity. That means that activities sort of become similar or change in relationship to whether they occur coincidentally in time, and that's why it's by association. So we know that, for example, neurons can couple to each other because they have coincident activity, and this is possibly the first neurofeedback study that showed that activity of the brain can be modulated or changed outside of the training session. It means outside of this control period, the system doesn't go back to rest, but actually continues to produce this similar activity that was conditioned during neurofeedback. This was actually studied done in animals, in cats, and it was published in the Science Journal, sort of the best journal kind of in the field, in 1970. So Kamiya, for example, showed that you can control alpha rhythms, but he never showed that these rhythms actually change the pattern of the brain in the long term. So he demonstrated there's control of the rhythms, but this study actually demonstrated plasticity of these rhythms. And what it means is that actually, when they gave cats milk every time they produced this beta burst, and the green light would come on and then the milk would be dispensed, and basically the cat would learn to produce this rhythm to get more and more milk. And it's a simple operant conditioning procedure. Essentially what they found is when they still recorded this rhythm during sleep, the cats produced more of this rhythm in sleep. So this is kind of mysterious, what does this occur and how does this occur? And just to go back to the slide about synchronization, so how could we explain why these rhythms then generalize outside of the training session, outside of the control period? Well, the first thing, as I said, is that high amplitudes are associated with synchronization of the cells. And there's a rule and this is just another slide to show you that the firing of the neurons is related to the wave of the EEG, okay, and the phase of the EEG. So in this publication, what they looked at was, they looked at the alpha rhythm, which is basically a field that is entraining all the neurons, and this field extends to the membrane potentials of the neurons. And if you know how neuronal spiking occurs, you know that when you change the membrane potential of the neuron, it basically comes to a level where it can actually spike. So when it depolarizes the neuron, then the neuron spikes. It's a sudden change in potential. And the wave is actually this very polarization and depolarization of this membrane potential, of the collective neuronal population. So it's so-called haptic coupling, which means that the wave is entraining all the neurons to, all the membrane potentials of the neurons to do this. And so here you would basically, here you have low spiking, which corresponds to this peak you see here, alpha phase peak, and then the normalized multi-unit activity. This is the actual neural firing rate. at the peak of this wave, the spiking is low, and then at the trough, the spiking is high, and then at the peak again, it's low. And this is exactly here, traced here. So here low, this is the peak. That means the neuron is being hyperpolarized. In fact, it's inverted. So when you have an oscillation, at least in this case, intracranially, this wave here hyperpolarizes the neurons. That means the neurons become silent. Then the wave goes down, depolarizes neurons, then they all start spiking at once, and then again they depolarize, they stop spiking. So it's a collective, and what does that mean? Well, that means that actually all these neurons are doing the same thing in time when oscillations are high. So that means that you have a mechanism there for heavy implicitity, which means that these neurons are coincident in time, and here you see they're spiking. So if they're spiking together, so this is neuron 1, neuron 2, then essentially these neurons could get connected via heavy mechanism. And heavy mechanisms are defined by this kind of catchphrase, neurons that fire together, wire together, neurons that fire apart, wire apart. And in this case, you have two conditions. One is the neurons are in phase, that means the amplitude is high. Then they couple together and producing the big, sort of large amplitude rhythms. And here, they're out of phase, they're actually firing out of sync, and then decorrelating this connectivity between the neurons. So that's one potential way of explaining how these synchronization patterns emerge, both during control, but also long-term, the coupling establishes itself plastically. And I have an example for you here, how we can relate synchronization with coupling, physical coupling. So here we have functional synchronization in phase, and that's a functional measure, but is it related to maybe some kind of physical coupling between the elements? And hopefully this is going to work. So, some volume here. Alright, just restart this. So here we have an example of some metronomes, and you can think of metronomes as like oscillators. Actually, you can't see it. I don't know why, maybe it's because of the presentation mode. Circle. So these metronomes you can consider these metronomes like oscillators. So let's say each metronome is a neuron. And first of all, this person is going to start them off in random phase. So you just push them each independently of each other, and they're all going to oscillate at a certain phase. But the frequency is the same. Okay? And then you'll see what happens after a nice little physics trick. So at the moment, the system is desynchronized. It means each element is independent from the other. That's because there's no coupling between the neurons or between the metronomes. But if you introduce a platform, which means that you can introduce weak coupling, which means that these metronomes can exchange energy one from each other, you see they start to entrain each other, and you have like a perfect synchrony between the neurons, between the metronomes. And possibly a similar mechanism occurs in the brain where these oscillations, when you increase coupling and sort of connectivity between the cells by heavy plasticity, then a larger or lower synchronization can occur. Okay. Let's illustrate the point. Go back to my... Okay, good. So some actual empirical evidence for all of this theory. So essentially, this is a paper in 2010. You can't see there, but that showed that you can learn to control the alpha rhythm, but that there's also plasticity in the system. So you see here before neurofeedback, they did 5 sessions of neurofeedback, and this is the within session progress. So here's the resting state, and then they try to increase this alpha rhythm, as I showed you using feedback. And in fact, they are able to learn to control it. and increase the amplitude. And then at the end of this training, this is what you see at the occipital area, which is the kind of visual cortex. You see these nice alpha rhythm emerging from a person who usually produces this pattern at the beginning. And interestingly, there is this within session change, which you could call the sort of control aspect. But if you repeat this procedure multiple times, so on different days, so you can see here, this is the gray is the resting state. There's an increase of the signal, but then when they stop, the system doesn't go back to the baseline. In many cases, it actually goes in the direction of training. And then it drops a little bit because there's a sleep period and so on, and the plasticity is not, completely 100%. And the signal goes up again, and they're learning to control the signal. So every time the signal is a bit higher, but the resting state is also higher. So sort of generally, you incrementally condition this pattern in the brain. So that's with alpha rhythm. And let's talk about a little bit more about the spontaneous resting state. Well, here's an example of a healthy EEG power spectrum. So if you throw away time, and you just look at those two dimensions that I told you about, amplitude and frequency, then you can summarize that as a sort of a power spectral plot. And these are the different bands that classically are associated with EEG activity. The alpha band is the yellow band, which is usually has this maximum around 10 Hertz in the adult brain. Then you have the beta rhythm and also the slow rhythms, the theta and the delta rhythm. And this pattern is quite typical of a healthy person. So, and different regions have subtly different patterns, but more or less they coincide with this kind of maximum around the alpha wave and lower activity in these other bands flanking it. But this is when you're an adult. So what does this pattern look like as you develop? Well, initially, when we're born around after 12 months, you can see here that there's a higher, bigger skew towards the lower frequencies here, 2 Hertz, 4 Hertz. So this spectrum is more heavily weighted to the lower frequencies, and there's very little alpha rhythm here around 10. That's why the peak frequencies are around 7 Hertz or lower even when you're a child. Actually, when you're a child at 4 years old, this is still more skewed to the left, but the rhythm is now, peak rhythm has slightly increased to 9 Hertz. And when you become an adult, the spectrum is more shifted to the right, and there's more activity in this alpha band. So there's a developmental change there with time, and the synchronization patterns emerge differently with time. So how is that related anatomically? Well, there's a paper that shows that actually there's a relationship between changes in gray matter volume, so the actual gray matter, the sort of what consists of cell bodies, dendrites, and axons, and synapses. So as this spectral power in the low frequencies, so these are the theta and delta waves, so the slow wave power here. So it's basically the sort of the red and the dark red and the red bands here. This power is much higher when you're a child. And as you develop, this power decreases, okay? And that's related to changes in gray matter volume. So there's possibly an anatomical underpinning here that one explanation is that there's some kind of synaptic pruning going on, and there's less and less neurons that become more segregated, and therefore the signal becomes less synchronized, with less coupling in the system. So kind of like a gardener trying to, change the density of the garden to make it more specific to some functions. And why is that important? Well, we talk about psychiatry. So here's an example in ADHD, what these synchronization patterns look like. And you have here the delta rhythm, the theta rhythm, the alpha rhythm, as I showed you. And what happens in healthy subjects during development and people with ADHD. So if you start off with children and then adolescent adults, these are the the full traces. You see it starts off, as I showed you before, at a very large synchronization level here when you're a child. Then as you develop, you become an adolescent, you have intermediate synchronization. And then as an adult, you have the lowest power. So in fact, there's the lowest synchronization of these neurons in the theta and delta rhythm. And then if you look at ADHD, it's a similar thing. So they do develop with time in the proper direction, but actually they're consistently more synchronized than the healthy subject. So it's possible that there is some connectivity differences there between these populations, and that maybe by addressing these differences with neurofeedback, you could achieve better attention in these patients. And that's exactly what they tried. This was a study in 1995 by Lubar, one of the pioneering studies in neurofeedback, where they tried to downregulate the theta rhythm. So what did they do? They downregulate this band here, theta. This difference here, this between this trace and this trace, they basically asked children to suppress this theta rhythm and see, okay, is there plasticity in the system? And if there is, does it change their behavior? And the first thing they found was that there's a difference between the learners and the non-learners. And what I mean by learners is what you would call good controllers and bad controllers. So the ones who can actually change the signal online, which is decrease this theta-beta ratio. So the theta-beta ratio is simply the power ratio between the theta band and the beta band. So the beta band sort of stays constant and the theta band goes down, and therefore the ratio will decrease. And they found that the good learners, 11 of them, they had 17 subjects, 11 of them were able to control the theta rhythm. That's first quite lucky and quite important that even children with ADHD can do that. And that in the resting state, they have a difference post-training. After many sessions in neurofeedback, something like 30 sessions, there's a difference there. So they actually normalize in the direction, so they change their EEG in the direction of normalization. But at the same time, the ones that did not change the online signal did not demonstrate any plastic changes in their resting state, in the spontaneous activity. And if you look at the change in ADHD scores, then the ones who had more, this is this group here, that had bigger changes in the resting state have a much bigger improvement in attention score. And here you could talk about also how neurofeedback learning is evaluated. Here there's probably some non-specific placebo response, which is certainly there in most interventions. But you can see that the neurofeedback good learning group had a stronger effect. I have to move quickly because I only have 10 minutes left. This was recently replicated in 2009 by the Heinrich group, where they gave the same protocol to a larger group of children, and they found this positive correlation between changes in theta amplitude and changes in clinical scores. So in fact, decreases in ADHD symptoms were related to decreases in theta. So there is a causality there between what you're training and the symptoms. Now I want to talk about one study of mine where we tried to desynchronize alpha amplitude in healthy subjects, and we had the design where we took the resting state here, and then we did the amplitude down-regulate alpha amplitude for 30 minutes, and then we have rest state. So this is a single session design, not many sessions. And we had two groups, one neurofeedback group, and the other sham, which basically was a replay of somebody else's brain activity that was not in real time with the subjects. So it was kind of fake feedback. And what did we find? Well, we found, firstly, what happened during the actual neurofeedback. You can see here, the resting state has a high amplitude of alpha, and these are naive subjects, never done neurofeedback before, and they were able to down-regulate this alpha rhythm using attention to the visual stimulus and keep it low for the 30 minutes of training. Each of these periods is 3 minutes. And basically the variance across the whole group was quite low for this type of control. And then it goes back to resting state again. Okay. So there's no real plasticity there per se. And interestingly, the sham group, they are exposed to the visual stimulation, so they do decrease the alpha as well, because they're focusing on the feedback. But this type of alpha activity has a much larger variance in the group, and it goes up to sort of resting state values over time. So there is a discrimination between the two groups here, between the sort of the closed loop real feedback and the sham. But what did we find interestingly in the resting state? So we just did a sort of percent signal change between the resting state alpha, that means resting state 2 divided by resting state 1, that's the percent change, and also neurofeedback divided by the first resting state. So that's your kind of training, your training signal, your control signal, and then your spontaneous activities change. And you can see here in the neurofeedback group, as predicted by the Heinrich study in ADHD, there's a positive correlation. It means more subjects decrease the signal during neurofeedback, that's the x-axis, the more they decrease it afterwards, after neurofeedback. So there's kind of a memory effect. You sort of imprint this signature in the resting state. Interestingly, sham, although they did change some alpha during the neurofeedback, these are different regions. So you can see it's not completely at 0, or it's higher. There is some variance there. But possibly due to the fact that the variability is quite high, it does not induce any plasticity in the resting state afterwards. So now for the sort of, I was scratching my head about how do we then unify all these different mechanisms of plasticity of the resting state as well as the control signal and so on. But one way to look at it is to consider that usually in rest you have a set point that's the oscillations of the system that's internally regulated. That's called the resting state, the spontaneous state. And let's say that's 20 degrees Celsius. That's your usual temperature in your house. And this system is working quite well. When it goes high, it's controlled intrinsically without feedback. And let's say you push the signal, you push the system to produce more of this. Let's say you increase the alpha amplitude. That means you ask the central heating unit to just basically, using the controller, you ask it to increase the temperature of the whole thing to, let's say, 25 degrees. And so now you have the house 25 degrees, much higher than the set point. So how does plasticity occur? So that's why you're at 25 degrees. And possibly if you keep it there long enough, you actually have plasticity of the set point itself. So in fact, you modify the set point to a higher value. So the resting state, you would then maybe shift this to 22, not completely to 25, because that would be impossible. You'll have to always have room between the control signal and the spontaneous noise. But this noise signal, or this so-called spontaneous activity, would now be moving in the direction of the training. And you can do the same thing going downwards if you try to decrease the amplitude of the signal. So in a way, you could think about this whole neurofeedback learning component as a sum of this control signal, which is what you calculate online, which has its own separate set point, and sort of some plasticity in the original set point of the resting state. That this plasticity of this resting state changes according to Hebbian mechanisms. And so this is basically the model is that you start off with a sort of a lower set point here at rest, and this is homeostatic, and then you train the signal, and then it ends up higher. Then a little bit, it loses a bit of plasticity there over time, but it goes up again, and then over time it increases to this value, kind of significantly higher. And then you could do the same thing maybe with, for example, theta and downregulation and ADHD. You would go in the opposite direction. So it's a Hebbian process. We've got 4 minutes left. But I want to talk about another thing, another paradox, which is homeostatic plasticity. Just when you thought that this was elegant, we found some evidence for changes in the opposite direction of training. So this is where I think really things get interesting. And how to explain this? Well, I don't know if you know the literature, but there is some evidence to show that actually these oscillations are intrinsically modulated over time, over the circadian cycle, over sort of the daytime and sleep cycle. And what happens is if you do this synchronization spectrum in the morning when you wake up, most healthy people, it will look like this. But by the end of the day, it will look like the blue trace. So in fact, it will accumulate synaptic plasticity through LTP and Hebbian mechanisms over time. As you learn during the day and doing things, these synchronization patterns will increase. And in fact, if you wake up the next morning, they'll decrease. So the whole thing is in a cycle where the system is homeostatically regulated to keep synchronization patterns within a certain range. And you can also, this has been replicated using a sleep deprivation study where they asked subjects to, you can't see the values here, but this is 6, 12, 18, 24, 30 hours of wake. So sleep deprivation, 6 hours from when you were supposed to go to sleep. So you see this is the theta amplitude. So this line here, this difference, it goes up with time the longer you stay awake. And we know that you have some severe attentional problems after about 30 hours of sleep deprivation. And this may be explained by this change in the synchronization pattern. So, maybe psychiatric populations also have these patterns because they are similar to patterns that are abnormally synchronized even in healthy subjects. And then interestingly, post-sleep, if you have recovery sleep, the system goes back to the baseline here. Okay, so the synchronization patterns are normalized with sleep. So one could think that sleep has another function apart from memory consolidation, but also keeping the system within a certain synchronization range. But where does homeostatic plasticity come in? Well, we ran the same protocol with some PTSD subjects, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychiatric patients, and we ran this alpha-down protocol. I won't tell you the reasons why. We found some stuff with mind wandering. We wanted to decrease mind wandering in subjects, but we hadn't actually looked at their resting state before. So we went ahead and did this. And what did we find? We found that at T1, this is the resting state, these subjects have a certain alpha amplitude, and then they decrease the alpha, right? And usually the alpha should be either the same or lower due to this control mechanisms, heavy learning. But in fact, the alpha is higher post-neurofeedback, and significantly higher than the initial value. So in fact, it's in the opposite direction of training. And so we were scratching our heads about this for some years, about what's going on here. And also interestingly, if you look at psychiatric self-reports in arousal, which is one of the cardinal symptoms of PTSD, in fact, there's a positive, negative correlation with the change in amplitude. So the more they increase the amplitude, the bigger the decrease in arousal they have. So the more they feel well-being after the session. So in fact, the more they produce the rhythm opposite to the training control signal, the more they feel sort of normalized in terms of symptoms. And here's the explanation, possibly. Well, then finally we ran some control subjects to see, okay, where does their resting state patterns lie in relation to healthy subjects? And interestingly, they at baseline they're much lower than the healthy subjects in alpha synchronization, and then as they do neurofeedback, they get into the same range. So by going in the opposite direction, they get normalized. How is this possible? Well, I think again it's due to this possibility of plasticity of set point. So the set point is reset homeostatically, but in this case it's in the opposite direction of training. So in fact, by going the opposite way and going to maybe some extremal value where the homostat is kind of reset or reawakened to produce the original value where it was before you had this illness, then it's able to produce more healthy rhythms again. And that's potentially the theoretical explanation, is that you maybe have these two extremes of order and disorder, and this is a sort of complexity versus order disorder model where the complexity of the system is highest in between these two extremes. So order would be everything's connected to everything else, it's like a lattice structure. Disorder is everything's disconnected from everything else, it's like a white noise independent signal. And that the biological systems or complex systems operate in this kind of intermediate region where you get some very complex patterns that nobody knows and understands. But this has actually been proposed by Tononi et al. In a paper in 1998, where actually it might have something to do with information integration. So if you think that in the brain information processing is the key, then you cannot have all the elements independent from each other because they will not be able to exchange information at all. So a brain is not a white noise signal, firstly, and we know that. But secondly, if everything's connected to everything else, then you just share the same information, and then you would have an epilepsy or whatever. So this extreme state is not beneficial either. So you would then assume that maybe intermediate synchronization, where you have a sort of a balance between coupling and independence between neurons, that is optimal for information processing. And that's maybe what the system is trying to do when it's self-tuning to these critical regions. So in ADHD, you can use heavy plasticity to go from higher order or high synchronization and higher coupling between these elements that they display to decrease this value and to go into this sort of sweet spot region where you have better information processing. And with PTSD, you can either go that way via heavy and like increase alpha, but if you were to go in the opposite direction, there's some kind of intrinsic knowledge in the system that prevents probably epilepsy or coma. Where if you use, the problem is that if you use heavy plasticity mechanism only, you could then decrease the power, increase the power into kind of really pathological values. So that's why the reason is why the system has homeostasis, is that if you go too low, the system will say, no, don't go there, that's not going to be healthy, and it just returns the system back. So by perturbing the system, you can then maybe reset this homostat into normalized values. So that's the overall model that we're proposing, and this is in the publication here in the Frontiers Neuroscience. Thank you for your time.
Y a-t-il des questions? On a le temps pour une ou deux questions dans la salle. Oui.
Désolé pour le retard, mais I would like to know if there's some long-term effects. What do we know about the maintaining of these effects, especially in ADHD?
I haven't talked about the actual evidence for long term, but there's a few studies that already show that follow-up studies outside of the training period essentially show that these effects are conserved. without any intermediate training. So essentially, those patterns that you leave, that remain after the training, they generalize to 6 months later or beyond. So this has been shown in ADHD studies at 6-month follow-up, in autism studies at 12-month follow-up, alcoholism in 1.5 year follow-up, and even in epilepsy 12 years after, they show that most of these patients remain symptom-free, or at least they have decreased symptoms after training. And that's possibly, it's an interesting question because it maybe shows a distinction between what I would call extrinsic neuromodulation approaches and intrinsic neuromodulation approaches, which is this latter being neurofeedback and the former being TMS or medication and so on. It's because of the system homeostasis. If you introduce an external agent or you stimulate from the outside, then the system is reactive to that. So once you take that stimulation away, the system kind of goes back to its passive state. But if the system itself is doing the work, then it will reset this point to be more stable. Just like if you use your own muscles to do the training, they will be stable after some training period. But if you were to use just anabolic steroids, then as soon as you take the steroids away, then the system just goes back to being. So the intrinsic training is important to keep the system robust in the long term. And as you enter into this new configuration, cognitively as well as neurophysiologically, probably the system maintains itself because it's now found a new sort of configuration, and then it can do those things that it wasn't able to do before. Let's say pay attention to homework or whatever, different things. So there is no evidence to show that these symptoms slide back to baseline after training.
I have a question on this homeostatic plasticity. So, what does trigger the homeostatic plasticity? Because if the system goes back to its state,
Yeah.
Why didn't why is it not doing that spontaneously? Why do you need the actually push that?
A very good question. Well, I would say that that's to do with sort of in a healthy system. The homeostasis works very well. So, like in sleep and awake, the system is able to return it immediately to the state where it's originally at. But I guess it's also about the plasticity of the set point. So, if you have, well, in psychiatric disorders, there are different causes for it, possibly. But for example, you might have a genetic problem like epilepsy. That's a homeostasis kind of problem, where you might not be able to resolve it, or you have in another disease, neurodegenerative disease, there's other reasons. But let's take something that's like PTSD, which is acquired because of some kind of external event, and the system was quite healthy before that. Well, the plasticity of the system is much stronger when you have an emotional episode. So you have some release maybe of neuromodulators that facilitate plasticity. So during a very traumatic episode or a fearful episode, the system might go into this more disorderly state, but for some reason it gets locked there. So the plasticity is too strong, and that's so-called maladaptive plasticity. So in many cases, you need plasticity in the brain to learn and to adapt, but you might have sort of the other side of the sword, or the negative effects of plasticity, like addiction or PTSD, which is the system is too plastic for whatever reason, because that's just the way that person is made, and that then sort of the negative aspect comes to play. And then you're not able to come out of that state, but if under controlled conditions you're able to perturb the system, and then somehow it's able to get a bit more dynamic range, then the system goes back to normal. At least that's the norm.
Bravo en tout cas à Thomas.